Hi, everyone. It is Monday, April 6th, 2020, coming to you today from Orlando, Florida, as I have been from the beginning. And you are wherever you are. And in that, I hope that you're safe and well and taking care of yourself. Hi, Randy. Randy, you are one provocative poster. So I think you're always trying to stir something up with your comments. Thank you for that. It makes it more entertaining. Boy, the news that we're facing today and what appears to be building this week is tough. It's going to demand from all of us a level of strength and resilience and commitment to bounce back that is very real. So what better thing to do when you're looking for resolve and commitment to survive and do well? What better thing to do than read from Laura Ingalls Wilder? I mean, really, what could be better than that? So today, from Farmer Boy, Late Harvest and the County Fair. 2 chapters. So I'm seeing lots of people checking in here. Yeah, nice everybody. I'm looking down. It's sort of cool the way, when you're on Facebook Live and you see the comments come up on the left side of the screen, and on the right side of the screen you see the hearts and the thumbs up and all that. It's very cool. It's an amazing technology. I mean, this technology is from Facebook, and there are other similar technologies out there, but this Facebook technology is allowing people to stay connected to each other that before this technology, this just would have been impossible. And to be able to do it out of your phone and have a message go all over the world is just amazing. And what more can you say about it? Let's start. Late Harvest is the chapter. Now the harvest moon shone round and yellow over the fields at night, and there was a frosty chill in the air. All the corn was cut and stood in tall shocks. The moon cast their black shadows on the ground where the pumpkins lay naked above their withered leaves. Almanzo's milk-fed pumpkin was enormous. He cut it carefully from the vine, but he could not lift it. He could not even roll it over. Father lifted it into the wagon and carefully hauled it to the barn and laid it on some hay to wait until county fair time. All the other pumpkins Almanzo rolled into piles, and Father hauled them to the barn. The best ones were put in the cellar to make pumpkin pies, and the rest were piled on the south barn floor. Every night, Almanzo cut up some of them with a hatchet and fed them to the cows and calves and the oxen. The apples were ripe. Almanzo and Royal and Father set ladders against the trees and climbed into the leafy tops. They picked every perfect apple carefully and laid it in a basket. Father drove the wagon full of baskets slowly to the house, and Almanzo helped carry the baskets down cellar and lay the apples carefully in the apple bins. They didn't bruise one apple, for a bruised apple will rot, and one rotten apple will spoil the whole bin. I don't think Laura coined this phrase, but it was neat that she worked it in to the narrative of the story, to the telling of the story. They didn't bruise one apple. One rotten apple will spoil the whole bin. The cellar began to have its winter smell of apples and preserves. Mother's milk pans had been moved upstairs to the pantry till spring came again. After the perfect apples had all been picked, Almanzo and Royal could shake the trees. That was fun. They shook the trees with all their might, and the apples came rattling down like hail. They picked them up and threw them into the wagon, and they were only cider apples. Almanzo took a bite out of one whenever he wanted to. Now it was time to gather the garden stuff. Oh, by the way, before we move on from the apples, if you ever go to the farm alone and you're ever there in the fall, I can't imagine that they are the same apple trees that Almanzo had as a boy, but there are wonderful apple trees in front of the house in Malone that give wonderful tart apples in the fall. I've been there, I've tasted them. They're amazing. Now it was time to gather the garden stuff. Father hauled the apples away to the cider mill, but Almanzo had to stay at home, pulling beets and turnips and parsnips and carrying them down cellar. He pulled the onions, and Alice braided their dry tops in long braids. The round onions hung thick on both sides of the braids, and Mother hung them in the attic. Almanzo pulled the pepper plants, while Alice threaded her darning needle and strung red peppers like beads on a string. They were hung up beside the onions. Father came back that night with 2 big hogsheads of cider. He rolled them down cellar. There was plenty of cider to last until next apple harvest. Next morning, a cold wind was blowing, and storm clouds were rolling up against the gray sky. Father looked worried. The carrots and potatoes must be dug quickly. Almanzo put on his socks and moccasins, his cap and coat and mittens, and Alice put on her hood and shawl. She was going to help. Father hitched Bess and Beauty to the plow and turned a furrow away from each side of the long rows of carrots. That left the carrots standing in a thin ridge of earth, so they were easy to pull. Almanzo and Alice pulled them as fast as they could, and Royal cut off the feathery tops and threw the carrots in the wagon. Father hauled them to the house and shoveled them down a chute into carrot bins in the cellar. The little red seeds that Almanzo and Alice planted had grown to 200 bushels of carrots. Mother could cook all she wanted, and the horses and cows could eat raw carrots all winter. Lazy John came to help with potato digging. Father and John dug the potatoes with hoes, while Alice and Almanzo picked them up and put them in baskets and emptied the baskets into a wagon. Royal left an empty wagon in the field while he hauled the full one to the house and shoveled the potatoes through the cellar window into the potato bins. Almanzo and Alice hurried to fill the empty wagon while he was gone. They hardly stopped at noon to eat. They worked at night till it was too dark to see. If they didn't get the potatoes into the cellar before the ground froze, all the year's work in the potato field would be lost. Father would have to buy potatoes. "I never saw such weather for this time of year," Father said. Early in the morning, before the sun rose, they were hard at work again. The sun did not rise at all. Thick gray clouds hung low overhead. The ground was cold and the potatoes were cold, and a sharp cold wind blew gritty dust into Almanzo's eyes. He and Alice were sleepy. They tried to hurry, but their fingers were so cold that they fumbled and dropped potatoes. Alice said, "My nose is so cold. We have ear muffs. Why can't we have nose muffs?" Almanzo told Father that they were cold, and Father told him, "Get a hustle on, son. Exercise will keep you warm." They tried, but they were too cold to hustle very fast. The next time Father came digging near them, he said, "Make a bonfire of the dry potato tops, Almanzo. That'll warm you." So Alice and Almanzo gathered an enormous pile of potato tops. Father gave Almanzo a match, and he lighted the bonfire. The little flame grabbed a dry leaf, and it ran eagerly up a stem, and it crackled and spread and rushed roaring into the air. It seemed to make the whole field warmer. For a long time, they all worked busily. Whenever Almanzo was too cold, he ran and piled more potato tops on the fire. Alice held out her grubby hands to warm them, and the fire shone on her face like sunlight. "I'm hungry," Almanzo said. "So be I," said Alice. "It must be almost dinner time." Almanzo couldn't tell by the shadows because there was no sunshine. They worked, and still they did not hear the dinner horn. Almanzo was all hollow inside. He said to Alice, "Before we get to the end of this row, we'll hear it." But they didn't. Almanzo decided something must have happened to the horn. He said to Father, I guess it's dinner time." John laughed at him, and Father said, "It's hardly the middle of the morning, son." Almanzo went on picking potatoes. Then Father called, Put a potato in the ashes, Almanzo. That'll take the edge off your appetite. Almanzo put 2 big potatoes in the hot ashes, one for him and one for Alice. He piled ashes, hot ashes, all over them, and he piled more potato tops on the fire. He knew he should go back to work, but he stood in the pleasant heat, waiting for the potatoes to bake. He did not feel comfortable in his mind, but he felt warm outside, and he said to himself, I have to stay here to roast the potatoes. He felt bad because he was letting Alice work all alone, but he thought, I'm busy roasting a potato for her. Suddenly he heard a soft, hissing puff, and something hit his face. It struck on his face, scalding hot. He yelled and yelled. The pain was terrible, and he could not see. He heard shouts and running. Big hands snatched his hands from his face, and Father's hands tipped back his head. Lazy John was talking French, and Alice was crying, Oh, Father! Oh, Father! Open your eyes, son, Father said. Almanzo tried, but he could get only one open. Father's thumb pushed up the other eyelid, and it hurt. Father said, It's all right. The eye's not hurt. One of the roasting potatoes had exploded, and the scalding hot inside of it hit Almanzo. But the eyelid had closed in time. Only the eyelid, and his cheek burned. Father tied his handkerchief over the eye, and he and Lazy John went back to work. Almanzo hadn't known that anything could hurt like that burn, but he told Alice that it didn't hurt much, and he took a stick and he dug the other potato out of the ashes. I guess it's your potato, he snuffled. He wasn't crying, but only tears kept running out of his eyes and down inside his nose. No, it's yours, Alice said. It was my potato that exploded. How do you know which it was? Almanzo asked. This one's yours because you're hurt, and I'm not hungry anyway, not very hungry, said Alice. You're as hungry as I be, Almanzo said. He could not bear to be selfish anymore. You eat half, he told Alice, and I'll eat half. The potato was burned black outside, but the inside was white and mealy, and a most delicious baked potato smell steamed out of it. They let it cool a little, and then they gnawed the inside out of the black crust. And it was the best potato they had ever eaten. They felt better, and they went back to work. We all love baked potatoes. I mean, one of my favorite things is a baked potato, very crisp on the outside. Catherine, who's hopefully listening today, makes wonderful baked potatoes, and they are always crispy on the outside. And I think the skin is my favorite part of the baked potato. And if we don't finish the baked potatoes, Catherine will cook them for breakfast the next morning with eggs, and just incredible. Enough of that. Enough of my meals. Here's a picture of Almanzo and Alice. They're eating hot potato. You can see the handkerchief over his eye. Almanzo's face was blistered and his eye was swelled shut, but Mother put a poultice on it at noon and another at night, and the next day it did not hurt so much. Just after dark on the third day, he and Alice followed the last load of potatoes to the house. The weather was growing colder every minute. Father shoveled the potatoes into the cellar by lantern light, while Royal and Almanzo did all the chores. They had barely saved the potatoes. That very night, the ground froze. A miss as good as a mile, Mother said, but Father shook his head. Too close to suit me, he said. Next thing will be snow. We'll have to hustle to get the beans and corn under cover. He put the hay rack on the wagon, and Royal and Almanzo helped him haul the beans. They pulled up the bean stakes and laid them in the wagon, beans and all. They worked carefully, for a jar would shake the beans out of the dry pods and waste them. When they had piled all the beans on the south barn floor, they hauled in the shocks of corn. The crops had been so good that even Father's great barn roofs could not shelter all the harvest. Several loads of corn shocks had to be made in the barnyard. Had to be put in the barnyard, and Father made a fence around them to keep them safe from the young cattle. All the harvest was in now. Cellar and attic and the barns were stuffed to bursting. Plenty of food and plenty of feed for all the stock was stored away for the winter. Everyone could stop working for a while and have a good time at the county fair. When you think about it, the things that the Wilders sold are really relatively few items compared to what they grew for themselves and stored for themselves in order just to feed themselves for the coming winter and early spring and spring of the following year. It was, they were really in as farmers to sustain themselves. That was their business. And then, of course, they would sell a horse, or they would sell some of the other, some of the butter. They would sell the butter and those kinds of things. But that was a relatively modest compared to everything that they grew and kept for themselves because they needed it to survive. I just think it's amazing. County fair. Early in the frosty morning, they all set out for the fair. All of them were dressed up in their Sunday clothes except Mother. She wore her second best and took an apron, for she was going to help with the church dinner. Under the back buggy seat was the box of jellies and pickles and preserves that Eliza Jane and Alice had made to show at the fair. Alice was taking her woolwork embroidery too, but Almanzo's milk-fed pumpkin had gone the day before. It was too big to go in the buggy. Almanzo had polished it carefully. Father had lifted it into the wagon and rolled it onto a soft pile of hay, and they had taken it to the fairgrounds and given it to Mr. Paddock. Mr. Paddock was in charge of such things. This morning, the roads were lively with people driving to the fair, and in Malone, the crowds were thicker than they had been on Independence Day. All around the fairgrounds were acres of wagons and buggies, and people were clustered like flies. Flags were flying, and the band was playing. Mother and Royal and the girls got out of the buggy at the fairgrounds, but Almanzo rode with Father to the church sheds and helped unhitch the horses. The sheds were full, and all along the sidewalks, streams of people in their best clothes were walking to the fair, while buggies dashed up and down the streets in clouds of dust. "Well, son," Father asked him, "what shall we do first?" "Well, I want to see the horses," Almanzo said. So Father said they would look at the horses first. The sun was high now, and the day was clear and pleasantly warm. Streams of people were pouring into the fairgrounds, with a great noise of talking and walking, and the band was playing gaily. Buggies were coming and going. Men stopped to speak to Father, and boys were everywhere. Frank went by with some of the town boys, and Almanzo saw Miles Lewis and Aaron Webb, but he stayed with Father. They went slowly past the tall back of the grandstand and past the low, long church building. This was not the church, but a church kitchen and a dining room at the fairgrounds. A noise of dishes and rattling pans and a chatter of women's voices came out of it. Mother and the girls were inside it somewhere. Beyond it was a row of stands and booths and tents, all gay with flags and colored pictures and men shouting, "Step this way, step this way, only 10 cents, 1 dime, the 10th part of $1. Oranges, oranges, sweet Florida oranges. Cures all ills of man and beast, prizes for all, prizes for all. Last call, boys, put down your money, step back, don't crowd." One stand was a forest of striped black and white canes. If you could throw a ring over a cane, a man would give it to you. There were piles of oranges and trays of gingerbread and tubs of pink lemonade. There was a man in a tailcoat and a tall, shining hat who put a pea under a shell and then paid money to any man who would tell him where the pea was. "I know where it is, Father," Almanzo said. "Be you sure?" Father asked. "Yes, Father," said Almanzo, pointing. "Under that one." He pointed. "Well, son, we'll wait and see," Father said. Just then, a man pushed through the crowd and laid down a $5 bill beside the shells. There were 3 shells. The man pointed to the same shell that Almanzo had pointed at. The man in the tall hat picked up the shell there was no P under it. The next instant, the $5 bill was in his tailcoat pocket, and he was showing the P again and putting it under another shell. Almanzo couldn't understand it. He had seen the P under that shell, and then it wasn't there. He asked Father how the man had done it. I don't know, Almanzo, Father said, but he knows it's his game. Never bet your money on another man's game. They went on to the stock sheds. The ground there was trodden into deep dust by the crowd of men and boys. It was quiet there. Almanzo and Father looked for a long time at the beautiful bay and brown and chestnut Morgan horses with their flat, slender legs and small, neat feet. The Morgans tossed their small heads and their eyes were soft and bright. Almanzo looked at them all carefully, and not one was a better horse than the colts Father had sold last fall. Then he and Father looked at the thoroughbreds with their longer bodies and thinner necks and slim haunches. The thoroughbreds were nervous. Their ears quivered and their eyes showed the whites. They looked faster than the Morgans, but not so steady. Beyond them were 3 large speckled gray horses. Their haunches were round and hard. Their necks were thick and their legs were heavy. Long, bushy hair hid their big feet. Their heads were massive, their eyes quiet and kind. Almanzo had never seen anything like them. Father said they were Belgians. They came from a country called Belgium in Europe. Belgium was next to France, and the French had brought such horses in ships to Canada. Now Belgian horses were coming from Canada into the United States. Father admired them very much. He said, "Look at that muscle. They'd pull a barn if hitched to it." Well, Almanzo asked him, "What's the good of a horse that can pull a barn? I mean, we don't want to pull a barn. A Morgan has muscle enough to pull a wagon, and he's fast enough to pull a buggy, too." "You're right, son," Father said. He looked regretfully at the big horses and shook his head. "It would be a waste to feed all that muscle, and we've got no use for it. You're right." Almanzo felt important and grown up, talking horses with Father. Beyond the Belgians, a crowd of men and boys was so thick around a stall that not even Father could see what was in it. Almanzo left Father and wiggled and squeezed between the legs until he came to the bars of the stall. Inside it were 2 black creatures. He had never seen anything like them. They were something like horses, but they were not horses. Their tails were bare, with only a bunch of hair at the tip. Their short, bristly manes stood up straight and stiff, and their ears were like rabbits' ears. Those long ears stood up above their long, gaunt faces, and while Almanzo stared, one of the creatures pointed its ears at him and stretched out its neck. Close to Almanzo's bulging eyes, its nose wrinkled and its lips curled back from long, yellow teeth. Almanzo couldn't move. Slowly the creature opened its long, fanged mouth, and out of its throat came a squawking roar. "Ee-yaw! Ee-yaw!" How's that? "Ee-yaw!" Almanzo yelled, and he turned and butted and clawed and fought through the crowd toward Father. The next thing he knew, he reached Father, and everybody was laughing at him. Only Father did not laugh. "It's only a half-breed horse, son," Father said. "The first mule you ever saw." "You're not the only one that was scared either," said Father, looking around the crowd. Almanzo felt better when he saw the colts. There were 2-year-olds and yearlings. Sorry, I want to start that again. Almanzo felt better when he saw the colts. There were 2-year-olds and yearlings and some little colts with their mothers. Almanzo looked at them carefully, and finally he said, "Father, I wish..." "What, son?" Father asked. "Father, there's not a colt here that can hold a candle to Starlight. Couldn't you bring Starlight to the fair next year?" Well, Father said, "we'll see about that when next year comes." Then they looked at the cattle. There were fawn-colored Guernseys and Jerseys that come from islands named Guernsey and Jersey near the coast of France. They looked at the bright red Devons and gray Durhams that come from England. They looked at the young steers and yearlings, and some were finer than Star and Bright. They looked at the sturdy, powerful yoke oxen. All the time, Almanzo was thinking that if only Father would bring Starlight to the fair, Starlight would be sure to take a prize. When they looked at the big Chester white hogs and the smoother, smaller black Berkshire hogs, Almanzo's pig Lucy was a Chester white. But he decided that someday he would have a Berkshire too. They looked at merino sheep like Father's, with their wrinkled skins and short, fine wool, and they looked at the larger Cotswold sheep, whose wool is longer but coarse. Father was satisfied with his merinos. He would rather raise less wool, of finer quality, for Mother to weave. By the time it was noon, and Almanzo had not seen his pumpkin yet. By this time it was noon, and Almanzo had not seen his pumpkin yet. But he was hungry. Almanzo's always hungry. I can relate to that. But Almanzo was hungry, so they went to dinner. The church dining room was already crowded. Every place at the long table was taken, and Eliza Jane and Alice were hurrying with the other girls who were bringing loaded plates from the kitchen. All the delicious smells made Almanzo's mouth water. Father went into the kitchen, and so did Almanzo. It was full of women, hurriedly slicing boiled hams and roasts of beef and carving roast chickens and dishing up vegetables. Mother opened the oven of the huge cook stove and took out roasted turkeys and ducks. 3 barrels stood by the wall, and long iron pipes went into them from a cauldron of water boiling on the stove. Steam puffed from every crevice of the barrels. Father pried off the cover of one barrel. The clouds of steam came out. Almanzo looked into the barrel, and it was full of steaming potatoes and their clean brown skins. The skin broke when the air struck them and curled back from the mealy insides. All around Almanzo were cakes and pies of every kind, and he was so hungry he could have eaten them all, but he dared not touch even a crumb. At last, he and Father got places at the long table in the dining room. Everyone was merry, talking and laughing, but Almanzo simply ate. He ate ham and chicken and turkey and dressing and cranberry jelly. He ate potatoes and gravy, succotash, baked beans and boiled beans and onions and white bread and rye and Injun bread and sweet pickles and jam and preserves. Then he drew a long breath and he ate pie. When he began to eat pie, he wished he had eaten nothing else. He ate a piece of pumpkin pie and a piece of custard pie, and he ate almost a piece of vinegar pie. Never had vinegar pie. I have no idea what that, I guess one presumes it tastes like vinegar. He tried a piece of mince pie, but he could not finish it. He just couldn't do it. There were berry pies and cream pies and vinegar pies and raisin pies, but he could not eat any more. Thank goodness he would have exploded. I mean, I just can't believe what this kid can eat. It's just unbelievable what he can put away. Laura was just jealous as she wrote this, or appreciative of how much her husband ate as a boy. And boy, she didn't mince any of it, or she didn't lose any of it. He was glad to sit down with Father in the grandstand. They watched the trotting horses flashing by, warming up for the races. Little puffs of dust rose in the sunshine behind the fast sulkies. Royal was with the big boys down at the edge of the track with the men who were betting on the races. Father said it was all right to bet on races if you wanted to. You get a run for your money, he said, but I would rather get something more substantial for mine. The grandstand filled up till people were packed in by all the tiers of seats. The light sulkies. Oh, and by the way, again, if you ever get a chance to go to Malone, when you go into Malone, you pass the county fairgrounds. And the county fairgrounds are there just as, the picture I'm going to show you in a minute of the grandstands is exactly what the grandstands looks like today. Now, I don't know that they looked like that when Almanzo was there as a child, but what Garth Williams pictures in the book is just what's there now. So that's really, really fun if you get a chance to do that. I couldn't recommend it more highly. The Wilder Farm is among the very best places to visit in the Laura Ingalls Wilder world. it is the most out of the way of all the places that she writes about. She never lived there. It's the most out of the way, but it's the most complete. And I say that with no disparaging of the other locations, because everyone does what they can do. But the Wilder Farm is fortunate that it is complete, and it has been rebuilt and refurbished to be what it was when the Wilders were there, for the enjoyment of people who come and see it. So I just say that. You should get there. Let's see. So the light sulkies were lined up in a row, and the horses tossed their heads and pawed the ground, eager to start. Almanzo was so excited he could hardly sit still. He picked the horse he thought would win, a slim, bright chestnut thoroughbred. Somebody shouted. All at once, the horses were flying down the track. The crowd was one roaring yell. Then suddenly, everyone was still in astonishment. An Indian was running down the track behind the sulkies. He was running as fast as the horse. Oh, we're back. We lost connection there for a second. Here's a picture of the grandstand looking down at the track, from the grandstand looking down at the track in Malone. Everyone began to shout, "He can't do it! $2, you'll keep up! The bay, come on! $3 on the Indian! Watch that chestnut! Look at the Indian!" The dust was blowing on the other side of the track. The horses were flying, stretching out above the ground. All the crowd was up on the benches, yelling. Almanzo yelled and yelled. Down the track, the horses came pounding. Come on, the bay! They flashed past too quickly to be seen. Behind came the Indian, running easily in front of the grandstand. He leaped high in the air, turned a handspring, and stood saluting all the people with his right hand. The grandstand shook with the noise of shouting and stamping. Even Father was shouting, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" The Indian had run that mile in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, as fast as the winning horse. I'm going to stop here. The world record, which was set, I think at the end of the last century, the world record for the mile, running the mile, is 3:43. I'm sorry, but there is no way in the 1800s this Indian ran a mile in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. It just didn't happen. I don't know if anyone, who knows if they had a clock on it. I think Laura thought that was a fast time. Yeah, that was a blistering fast time. That was an astonishingly fast time. Is it possible? Yes, I guess in the world of human performance, it's possible, but so incredibly unlikely when the world record at this point today, more than 100 years later, stands at 3:43. I'll just leave it at that. He was not even panting. Yeah, the Indian wasn't even panting. He saluted all the cheering people again and walked off the track. The bay horse had won. There were more races, but soon it was 3 o'clock. Time to go home. Driving home was exciting that day because there was so much to talk about. Royal had thrown a ring over one of the black and white striped canes, and he had it. Alice had spent a nickel for peppermint candy. She broke the striped stick in two, and each had a piece to suck slowly. It seemed strange to be home, but only long enough to do the chores and sleep. The next morning, they were driving away again. There were 2 more days of the fair. This morning, Almanzo and Father went quickly past the stock sheds to the display of vegetables and grains. Almanzo caught sight of the pumpkins at once. They shone out brightly, golden among all the duller things, and there was Almanzo's pumpkin, the largest of them all. "Don't be too sure of getting the prize, son," Father said. "It isn't size that counts as much as quality." Almanzo tried not to care too much about the prize. He went away from the pumpkins with Father, though he couldn't help looking back at his pumpkin now and then. He saw the fine potatoes, the beets, turnips, rutabagas, and onions. He fingered the brown, plump kernels of wheat and the grooved pale oats. the Canada peas and navy beans and speckled beans. He looked at ears of white corn and yellow corn and red and white and blue corn. Father pointed out how closely the kernels grew on the best ears, how they covered even the tip of the cob. Now, that's unusual. I mean, if you see good corn today, it's unusual that you get corn all the way to the tip of the cob. But that's the standard. People walked slowly up and down looking. There were always some people looking at the pumpkins, and Almanzo wished they knew that the biggest pumpkin was his. After dinner, he hurried back to watch the judging. The crowds were larger now, and sometimes he had to leave Father and squirm between people to see what the judges were doing. The 3 judges wore badges on their coats. They were solemn and talked together in low voices so that no one heard what they said. They weighed the grains in their hands and looked at them closely. They chewed a few grains of wheat and of oats and to see how they tasted. They split open peas and beans, and they shelled a few kernels off of each ear of corn to make sure how long the kernels were. With their jackknives, they cut the onions in two and the potatoes. They cut very thin slices of the potatoes and held them up to the light. The best part of a potato is next to the skin, and you can see how thick the best part is if you hold a very thin slice to the light and look through it. The thickest crowd pressed around the table where the judges were and watched without saying anything. There wasn't a sound. When at last the tall, thin judge with the chin whiskers took a snip of red ribbon and a snip of blue ribbon out of his pocket. The red ribbon was second prize. The blue one was first prize. The judge put them on the vegetables that had won them, and the crowd breathed a long breath. Then, all at once, everybody talked. Almanzo saw the people who didn't get any prize and the person who got second prize all congratulated the winner. If his pumpkin didn't get a prize, he would have to do that. He didn't want to, but he guessed that he must. At last, the judges came to the pumpkins. Almanzo tried to look as if he didn't care much, but he felt hot all over. The judges had to wait till Mr. Paddock brought them a big, sharp butcher knife. The biggest judge took it and thrust it with all his might into a pumpkin. He bore down hard on the handle and cut a thick slice out. He held it up, and all the judges looked at the thick yellow flesh of the pumpkin. They looked at the thickness of the hard rind and at the little hollow where the seeds were. They cut tiny slices and tasted them. Then the big judge cut open another pumpkin. He had begun with the smallest. The crowd pressed tight against Almanzo. He had to open his mouth to get a breath. At last the judge cut open Almanzo's big pumpkin. Almanzo felt dizzy. The inside of his pumpkin had a big hollow for seeds, but it was a big pumpkin. It had lots of seeds. Its flesh was a little paler than the other pumpkins. Almanzo didn't know whether that made any difference or not. The judges tasted it. He could not tell from their faces how it tasted. Then they talked together for a long time. He could not hear what they said. The tall, thin judge took his hand and tugged his whiskers. He cut a thin slice from the yellowest pumpkin and a thin slice from Almanzo's pumpkin and tasted them. He gave them to the big judge, and he tasted them. The fat judge said something, and they all smiled. Mr. Paddock leaned over the table and said, "Good afternoon, Wilder. You and the boy are taking in the sight, I see. Having a good time, Almanzo?" Almanzo could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Yes, sir." The tall judge had taken the red ribbon and the blue ribbon out of his pocket. The fat judge, who took hold of his sleeve, and all the judges put their heads together again. The tall judge turned around slowly. Slowly, he took a pin from his lapel and stuck it through the blue ribbon. He was not very near Almanzo's big pumpkin. He was not near enough to reach it. He held out the blue ribbon above another pumpkin. He leaned and stretched out his arm slowly, and he thrust the pin into Almanzo's pumpkin. Here he is, thrusting the pin into Almanzo's pumpkin. Look at Almanzo just sitting there, wondering what's going to happen. Look at the size of that pumpkin. Father's hand clapped on Almanzo's shoulder. All at once, Almanzo could breathe, and he was tingling all over. Mr. Paddock was shaking his hand. All the judges were smiling. Ever so many people said, "Well, well, Mr. Wilder, so your boy's got first prize." Mr. Webb said, "That's a fine pumpkin, Almanzo. Don't know as I ever saw a finer." Mr. Paddock said, "I never saw a pumpkin that beat it for size. How'd you raise such a big pumpkin, Almanzo?" Suddenly, everything seemed big and very still. Almanzo felt cold and small and scared. He hadn't thought before that maybe it wasn't fair to get a prize for a milk-fed pumpkin. Maybe the prize was for raising pumpkins in the ordinary way. Maybe if he told, they'd take the prize away from him. They might think that he tried to cheat. He looked at Father, but Father's face didn't tell him what to do. I kept hoeing it, and he said, and then he knew he was telling a lie. Father was hearing him tell a lie. He looked up at Mr. Paddock and said, "I raised it on milk. It's a milk-fed pumpkin. Is that all right?" "Yes, that's all right," Mr. Paddock answered. Father laughed. "There's tricks in all trades but ours, Paddock. And maybe a few tricks in farming and wagon making too, eh?" Then Almanzo knew how foolish he had been. Father knew all about the pumpkin, and Father wouldn't cheat. Afterwards, he went walking with Father among the crowds. They saw the horses again, and the colt that won the prize was not so good as Starlight. Almanzo did hope that Father would bring Starlight to the fair next year. Then they watched the foot races and the jumping contests and the throwing contests. Malone boys were in them, but the farmer boys won almost every time. Almanzo kept remembering his prize pumpkin and feeling good. Driving home that night, they all felt good. Alice's woolwork had won first prize, and Eliza Jane had a red ribbon, and Alice had a blue ribbon for jellies. And Father said the Wilder family had done itself proud that day. There was another day at the fair, but it wasn't so much fun. Almanzo was tired of having a good time. 3 days of it were too much. It didn't seem right to be dressed up again and leaving the farm. He felt unsettled, as he did at house cleaning time. He was glad when the fair was over and everything could go on as usual. And let's see. Oh, that's right. So wait a minute. That was the second chapter, wasn't it? I've gotten so lost in this. Let me go back here. Let me make sure I know you know what it was. There's this. Sorry. So I'm going back. This is a long chapter. County Fair. Yeah, all right. Yes, this was the second chapter. So that's it for the day, Monday, April 6th. I hope you've enjoyed these two chapters. And back tomorrow with more at the same time, 4:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 1:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I see Nikki says we could hang on for 3 chapters. Yeah, but I need to practice the chapters before I read them to you, so I sort of know what's coming. I mean, if I didn't, I make enough mistakes. I don't want to read it cold and really not know what's coming. So tomorrow, 2 more chapters, and I think we're going to finish this week. We're definitely on the back third we're actually almost exactly at the final third of the book. So I'm sure we'll finish it by the end of this week. Thanks very much for listening today. Have a good night. Wash your hands. Take care of yourself. Wear your masks. Take care of each other. It's going to be a long week. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.